Good morning, Your Honors, and may it please the Court. Athulachari for the Plaintiff Appellee. This is not a case about COVID-19. Not really. This court and its sister circuits have long rejected the notion that qualified immunity must be litigated and relitigated, infection by infection, disease by disease. So this is a case about disease, serious infectious disease, and what rights inmates have against being exposed to serious infectious disease. And the answer to that question has been clearly established since at least 1993, when the Supreme Court held in Helling that prison officials may not be deliberately indifferent to the risk of exposure of an inmate to serious communicable disease. The thornier questions in this case have to do with the underlying facts, like whether Thibault had subjective knowledge. But on an interlocutory review, this court ought not and need not answer those questions. On interlocutory review, this court has jurisdiction only over questions of law.
Do we have to accept the district court's determination that Thibault had subjective knowledge? Or is that some kind of mixed fact and law question that we can revisit anew on an interlocutory appeal?
It is a pure question of fact, Your Honor. The Supreme Court made this clear in a 2012 case called Ortiz, where it said that what happened and why certain actions were taken or omitted, which is to say mental state, are questions of fact that are not up for review on interlocutory appeals. Thibault's mental state, her subjective knowledge, is a pure question of fact, and the district court found that it was genuinely disputed. The district court found that because my client and his coworkers told Thibault that E-Block had inmates who had COVID-19 and were exhibiting symptoms, because they told her that, she had subjective knowledge. At least a reasonable jury could find that she had subjective knowledge of the risk, and she transferred my client to E-Block.
Is your argument essentially that Thibault knew or should have known that there would be risk in sending your client to E-Block?
No, Your Honor. It is that she knew. For purposes of summary judgment, the question is whether she was exposed to information concerning the risk. Once she's exposed to information concerning the risk, a reasonable jury could find from that she had actual subjective knowledge. Now, Thibault is free at trial to argue to the jury, hey, this guy told me that there were COVID-19 positive inmates in E-Block, but I just didn't believe him. I didn't believe him, so I never developed the subjective knowledge required. She can tell that to a jury, and a jury could believe her, but it could not. A reasonable jury, as the district court found, could believe my client that he told her, and she had no reason to disbelieve, or that she didn't disbelieve, and that despite that,
counsel. Let's say that the inmates' statements to Thibault were enough to give her subjective knowledge that there were COVID-positive inmates in E-Block. But Thibault also had promulgated policies that anyone showing symptoms of COVID has to be transferred to a different block and quarantined. And as far as she knew, those policies were being followed. So even if we say she had to believe the laundry workers when they told her there were COVID-positive inmates in E-Block, does she have to also assume that those inmates stayed in E-Block and weren't moved in accordance with the policy that she promulgated and that she thought was being followed?
What she has to do, Your Honor, what the deliberate indifference standard requires is that she respond reasonably to the knowledge that she obtained when the inmates told her there were COVID-positive inmates in E-Block. And a reasonable response could look like many things. It could look like going down to E-Block and just visiting and seeing, are there people here who look like they've got COVID? It could just be picking up the phone and calling the guard on duty in E-Block and saying, hey, is anyone coughing on the block right now? But what Thibault did was none of those things. Instead, she said, I don't care. You're going to move to E-Block, or I'm going to put you in the hole and I'm going to fire you from your job, and you're going to suffer the full panoply of punishment that prisons have to offer. That's not a reasonable response, or at least a jury could find, as the district court held, a jury could find that that was not a reasonable response. So on the three elements of deliberate indifference, objectively serious risk, the district court found that a reasonable jury could find that there were COVID-19 positive and symptomatic inmates in.
The warden lists a long list of containment and infection prevention protocols recommended by the CDC that she undertook to implement in her facility. And she says that it's undisputed that she implemented all of these containment and infection prevention protocols. Do you dispute any of them?
Yes, Your Honor, absolutely we do. We dispute. What the warden is referring to is in her statement of putative undisputed facts, she said, I followed CDC guidelines in setting up the infection prevention protocols in the prison. And sure, she did things like reduce visits or eliminate visits, screen staff upon entry. And in those, we don't dispute that she followed CDC guidelines. But when it comes to E-Block, where my client was transferred, we absolutely dispute it. And that's on pages 85 to 86 of the record, full of facts based on the declarations in the record that there were COVID-19 positive and symptomatic inmates in E-Block, that the laundry workers told Thibault that there were COVID-19 positive and symptomatic inmates in E-Block.
You know, in the early days of the pandemic, people, especially in congregate living facilities like prisons, were getting COVID all the time, just left, right, and center. So, let's say the prison is doing its best to move COVID positive inmates to F block or wherever, but it's having trouble keeping up because there's just so many of them, and every day another dozen or so people get sick. Does that mean they're liable now?
No, Your Honor, and that's sort of a separate question. Whether someone who was already in E-Block might have a claim because they weren't clearing out COVID positive inmates fast enough. That's a separate question. But here, my client and his coworkers in the laundry room were all in a part of the facility where they hadn't gotten COVID. And there were architectural features that made it so that it was unlikely that they'd get COVID there. They had solid walls, doors that shut, ventilation to the outside, while E-Block had bars instead of solid walls and no ventilation to the outside. And Thibault affirmatively increased the risk to my client by moving him from a place where he was safe and healthy and putting him in a place where he was unsafe and he got sick and he nearly died. And for that, yes, she is liable. If there's an objectively serious risk of harm in moving my client to E-Block, and there was, or at least a jury could find that there was, and Thibault knew of the risk, and a jury could find that she knew of the risk because the laundry workers told her, and she failed to take a reasonable response, like investigating the risk or reconsidering her decision to move the laundry workers to E-Block, then she is liable for that. I want to talk briefly about qualified immunity because, obviously both prongs have to...
The laundry workers say they told the warden that there were COVID positive inmates in E-Block. How did they know? Did they tell her how they knew? If not, is she just supposed to believe them on their say-so? Do prison staff have to believe every random thing an inmate says and take it seriously or face liability?
No, Your Honor. The answer to that last question is no. I think the laundry workers knew about conditions in E-Block because they had heard about them from the kitchen workers who lived on the bottom floor of E-Block. And once Thibault hears that from the laundry workers, is she obligated to believe them wholesale? No, she just has to take a reasonable response, like investigating. On the law side, on the qualified immunity side, the clearly established prong, every element of the deliberate indifference analysis has been clearly established here since at least 1993. In Helling, the Supreme Court held that prison officials may not be deliberately indifferent to a risk of serious communicable disease. So that means that serious communicable disease is an objectively serious risk, that knowledge of conditions that would expose an inmate to risk of contracting a serious disease is a kind of subjective knowledge to which an official develops a duty to take a reasonable response. And then continuing to expose the inmate to that risk, especially when there's no reason
Thibault
to do so.
says she relied on the recommendations of qualified medical staff in moving your client and his cohort to E-Block. If that's so, isn't your quarrel really with the medical professionals and not with Thibault?
No, Your Honor. And this is in her briefs. Thibault says that she relied on the advice of medical professionals in making the move. But if you look at the record, that's nowhere to be found. There's a 6 or 8 page declaration from her chief of medical staff who says all of the ways in which he advised Thibault on how to respond to pandemic conditions. And nowhere does he say, I advised her to move inmates from H block to E block. He just doesn't say that.
If Thibault knew that the laundry workers had never been in E block, and she says she did, is she still required to credit their essentially hearsay at best allegation that there were COVID-19 positive inmates there?
She is required to credit them to the extent that she must take a reasonable response, which, like I said, could just be an investigation, or it could be reconsidering her decision. I do see that my time has just about expired, so unless the court has further questions, for these reasons and for the reasons in the briefs, this court should affirm. Thank you.